Greetings, boxing fans. Welcome to the first edition of MC Boxing Commentary, trying to bring a logical and reasonable, rational viewpoint in the world of boxing. This week we've got a fight coming up on Saturday, July 28th, between Dillian the Villain Whyte and Joseph the Kiwi Parker. It should be an interesting matchup. I want to talk a little bit about this fight this week, as well as maybe look at the some of the controversy surrounding the Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua mashup that hasn't been able to get put on the table and signed. So first of all, Dillian the Villain Whyte. He's a 250-ish pound fighter, 6'4", from Brixton, London, England. Originally, I think, born in Jamaica. Those of you from the UK are really familiar with him. American boxing fans may not be as familiar with him, but I've been following Whyte's career since he was in the single-digit win column and have watched him develop into a solid fighter. Looking at his career over the last, say, 10 fights as he's developed, we've seen a pretty good learning curve. Now, the question, I go back to the Anthony Joshua fight when his shoulder was supposedly injured. It really didn't seem to be bothering him so much in the fight, but obviously he had surgery afterwards, so there was some kind of an injury there that supposedly limited his effectiveness beyond that second round left hook where he had Joshua wobbled. After that fight was over, to me it seemed like some of the punching power, some of the sting that was gone out of the punching power of Dillian Whyte. He hasn't really seemed to be as powerful of a fighter since that time. Now, people might point to the Lucas Brown fight as evidence that he's still a hard puncher, but when I look at that fight with Brown, I see more of really evidence that Brown just wasn't that good. Brown was out of shape, and it wasn't necessarily an overwhelming knockout. I've seen some people describe it as a vicious knockout that Dillian Whyte put on Lucas Brown. I wouldn't call it that. I would call it more of an accumulation knockout, because by the time Whyte put Brown down, he'd been pounding on him and pounding on him and pounding on him, and the end result was the knockout coming in round 6. So beyond that, you go back just one fight, and you had a snooze fest against Robert Helenius. Again, not an example of an aggressive, overwhelming KO artist. Prior to that, the fight with Malcolm Tan. Tan was calling him a journeyman is really maybe overstating his background. He doesn't have a very solid fight history with knockout losses to people like Alexander Dimitrenko, and a unanimous decision to Dominique Jenkins back in 2005. So you're looking at a guy with a long career who hasn't been that active. Since that fight, he hasn't had. You'd think in 12 years he would have had a significant number of fights. And he just hasn't had that level of activity. So when he fought Dillian Whyte, it was just a couple months after his previous 4-round knockout loss to Sergey Kuzmin, who was a 10-0 prospect. So to look at Whyte and at what he's done to this point. You go back to the Derek Chisora fight in 2016, December 2016. That was a really good fight. And Chisora, Del Boy, is a good fighter, but I would call him just an upper-level journeyman. He's not really a contender, maybe a fringe contender, a step up from Ian Lewiston, obviously, but still not to the level of anywhere near what you'd see in fighting a Joseph Parker. When you go back further than that, you got the Dave Allen fight, which really was kind of a boring fight. dominant performance by Whyte, because Allen's not really a boxer. He's a bit of a brawler, not a high level of skill. Interesting guy. I'm gonna have to do a video on him sometime. He's an interesting character. A couple fights before that, then was obviously the one loss that Whyte suffered to Anthony Joshua. And here's where I think one of the more impressive things about Whyte was on display. Whyte did a really good job against Anthony Joshua, particularly in the early going of getting off first. If you watch that fight, his jab wasn't, even though his hand speed is not really any better than Joshua, and his reach is certainly not as good as Joshua, Whyte did a good job of tripping that jab, pulling the trigger when he needed to, and he set up the hook pretty nicely. As he got a little more tired, and maybe it was the shoulder causing him problems, that seemed to slow down. So when we move over now and look at Parker, Parker hasn't had a knockout victory since knocking out Alexander Dimitrenko in October of 2016. So almost 2 years without a KO for a guy who was at one time viewed as a knockout artist. Now, most of his knockouts came against questionable opposition. Before the Carlos Takam fight in May of 2016, he really hadn't fought anybody except regional level fighters, people like Cali Meehan. Jason Pettaway was a solid journeyman level fighter that he fought in 2015, March of 2015. Sherman Williams, the same thing, kind of a journeyman level fighter. That was obviously a dominant performance, going to a decision for Parker. But you really can't. You look at people like Brian Minto, and going all the way back to 2013 against and well past his shelf date, Francois Botha. Not a very good level of opposition. Again, until the more recent fights. So you see Carlos Takam, Andy Ruiz Jr., where Parker won the WBO title. Some people viewed that fight as a bit of a controversial fight, where there were a lot of people thought Ruiz won the fight. I've gone back and rescored that fight personally numerous times, and I always come up the same way. I had Parker winning by 1 round. It was a close fight, but ultimately I did give it to Parker. Hughie Fury, to me that fight was kind of boring as mud, but Fury ran from him and just tried to keep the jab out and really didn't do a lot offensively. Parker had a difficult time chasing him around, not cutting the ring off, not closing the distance well, getting a little wild at times. And so it wasn't that good of a fight. The Joshua fight, I'll say, Joshua fight, Parker has taken a lot of criticism for, and maybe rightfully so. He didn't do much in that fight, but I keep going back. When I watch the fight, I go back to the 6th round, and in the 6th round, Parker began to get more aggressive and actually caught Joshua and had him buzzed, and the referee stepped in and paused the action. He stepped in and to break a clinch that really hadn't happened. There was no clinch. They were still going at each other on the ropes, and he stepped in, took them off the ropes, and really paused the fight for long enough for Joshua to regain his composure. I'm not one to blame officials or referees on affecting the outcomes of fights, even though they can somewhat. I don't like to point to things and think there's corruption or insinuate anything. But it really was an odd situation. It seemed strange. Probably the closest thing to that I can recall was when Joshua was going after Dominic Brazil and had Brazil hurt, and the referee just stepped in for seemingly no reason and gave Brazil a little chance to gather himself. I think that was in the 2nd round. There was no reason for him to step in, but he did. So he definitely, in the Parker and Joshua fight, the referee did affect the fight. Now, I don't know if breaking the clinches too soon was a consistent problem, but definitely in that 6th round when they were still fighting, there was no clinch, there was nothing to break. He just stepped in and separated them off the ropes and gave Joshua time to recover. From that point on, Parker struggled and really kind of went downhill for him. He wasn't aggressive enough. He was, I think, maybe a little bit timid because of the perception of the power AJ has, his strength. And there was also a great deal of difference in terms of size. Joshua had a pronounced reach advantage and did a pretty good job keeping Joseph Parker at range. Now, when Parker gets in the ring with Dillian Whyte, you're not going to have that kind of a difference in size and reach. They're almost identical in size. Dillian Whyte's generally a little bit heavier. His reach is slightly longer at 2 inches, but 2 inches is not a significant reach difference when you offset that with the hand speed brought to the table by Joseph Parker. I think we're going to see that to be the story of the fight if Parker gets off first. If Parker allows Dillian Whyte to dictate the action, Parker allows Dillian Whyte to keep his jab in his face and pull the trigger first, it could be a long night for Joseph Parker. It's not the kind of fight. You don't want to get into a counterpunching situation consistently with Dillian Whyte. Not that Joseph Parker is a bad counterpuncher, but when he starts throwing counterpunches, he oftentimes gets brought into brawls, and Whyte is not somebody that Parker wants to brawl with. If it becomes a chin check situation where they're brawling, I might actually have to go with Parker. People put Whyte as being the favorite if it becomes a fight rather than a boxing match. But Parker does have a really good chin, or at least a history of having a really good chin. I haven't really seen him rocked. Against Takam, he kind of punched himself out late and looked worn down. But you could almost say the same thing for when Dillian Whyte had his fight against Derek Chisora. Those two fights were kind of similar. Neither one were overwhelming, great performances by the fighters. And when you look at the scoring of Dillian Whyte, Derek Chisora was 115, 113, 114, 115, and 115, 114. So it was basically, you had just a 1 to 2 round difference in favor of Whyte, and then one judge had Chisora winning. You look at the Takam fight, it was a little more dominant performance in terms of the scoring, with 116, 112 on 2 cards, and then 115, 113, which is just, again, a 2-round difference. So if you look at Judge Ian Scott's scorecard at 115, 113, and you look at Howard John Foster's 115, 113 Derek Chisora score, and Howard John Foster is a solid judge. So you look at those two scores, very comparable. They were comparable performances against comparable level of opposition. Carlos Takam and Derek Chisora, comparable fighters. Takam is probably a little bit more compact, a little more throws punches a little tighter, maybe not as aggressive as a Derek Chisora, but perhaps a little more skill. So those were comparable fights. When these two guys meet on Saturday night, I think what we're going to see is one of two possibilities. If Parker comes out, sets the pace, sets combinations up with his jab, uses his lateral mobility, and slides to the side and hooks off the jab, I could see this being a really tough night for Dillian Whyte. Whyte will, I think, ultimately get frustrated. He's got a bit of a temper, and he hasn't fought anybody who had a pronounced speed advantage over him. And when he fought, you look at his last number of fights, going back to, say, Anthony Joshua. Since then, Ivaka Bakurin, David Allen, Ian Lewiston, Derek Chisora, Malcolm Tan, Robert Helenius, Lucas Brown, none of them had a speed advantage over Dillian Whyte. And I think arguably none of them were as hard of punchers as Joseph Parker. Even though Parker hasn't had a knockout again since 2016, I don't think any of those guys are harder punchers. You could make the argument Chisora maybe, but I don't think so. I think the crispness of the combinations, the sharpness of the punches of Parker, his right hand, I think is a better punch than in the arsenal of Chisora. So when they fight, What I think is going to happen is, if Parker jab hook, set up the right hand, if he does that, slides to his side, and keeps Dillian Whyte off balance, Dillian Whyte's going to become frustrated and leave himself open. What made Mike Tyson such a great fighter was not just his massive punching power or his massive advantage in hand speed that he had over other fighters. It was generally a combination of those things, but in the early days in particular, when he was such a dominant force in the division, his defense would frustrate his opponents. People had so much trouble hitting him that it was really hard to beat him. They would get frustrated trying to hit him. They would leave themselves open, and he would counter them and knock them out. With Dillian Whyte fighting Joseph Parker, I could see a situation where Parker's hand speed and lateral mobility will cause Dillian Whyte to get frustrated, and Dillian Whyte, in an effort to try to make this thing into a brawl, will leave himself open and get knocked out. That's going to happen. If it happens that way, it'll be somewhere in between the 7th and the 10th round. Somewhere in that range, we're going to see Joseph Parker take Dillian Whyte out. I don't really see a scenario where Dillian Whyte wins this fight any way other than just a flat-out brawl and Whyte has a better chin than I think he does. If it does turn into a fight more similar to the Dillian Whyte versus Derek Chisora fight, I just, that kind of fight is maybe the only one that I could see Dillian Whyte beating Joseph Parker. That's my 2 cents. Well, this is my inaugural video. It's gone a little bit long. I'll take and move the discussion of Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder over to another video that'll be much briefer. So if you like this commentary, like, comment, or subscribe. If you'll just leave a message. I've been a boxing fan for